We'll set up with Zoom, so just bear with me while we jump into it, inshallah. Okay, so I want to get into our goals for today's session. And just one more, sorry, community agreement. I know, again, most of you are pros. A friendly reminder that this is how we agree to conduct ourselves and how we kind of spend time together. Um, uh, One, I kind of want to add to for today's session and the series more broadly, inshallah, is just like it's okay to disagree, but let's disagree agreeably, if that makes sense. So the goal here is not that we all like walk out with the same strategy or the same tactics, but that we kind of reinforce our shared values and then are equipped with more tools in our toolbox, inshallah. And that will echo some of the research that I'm sharing today. So welcome everybody again, and really happy to have you here. Okay, so this is where we're headed with today's series, kind of how I've designed this in collaboration with lovely fellow community members. Okay, so alhamdulillah, again, this is a three-part series on civic engagement. We, as many of you know, we finished our annual community survey recently and had an open-ended question about like acknowledging that we've noticed obviously a huge political awakening and moment for our Muslim community as a whole, including many of us here in Center DC. So how should we respond? And there was definitely very, very varied responses. So I really appreciate, again, everyone sharing their thoughts. But there was a bit of a consensus that was like, let's hold more space to do this in a way that is consistent with what we're all about at Center DC, with our mission and values. So alhamdulillah, as many of you know, Osama in the room, my co-conspirator leading the board and amazing founding member of Center DC, has been teaching a 6-week class about social justice themes in the Sirah in the time of the Prophet and the earliest companions, peace be upon him. So that program, I think, is a great way to think about like strengthening our internal effectiveness as spiritual Muslim activists. And this program, I think, is a great complement to think about how can we become more effective, not only internally, but also externally by, again, equipping ourselves with kind of lessons learned from a lot of different places, a lot of different research, in order to be more effective for the long run. Because there's a real risk of activist burnout, as I'm sure you all know. And I really want, one of the ideas for people to think about for today is like, this is a marathon, it is not a sprint. There has never been a transformational social movement that happened overnight. Like, please, like I welcome you to challenge me on that because, and again, part of what we're going to explore today is like, okay, what was happening behind the scenes for years before we saw these watershed kind of history making moments, inshallah. So I hope that you feel, again, empowered and equipped for the long run. Today, thinking about what makes social movements win and how do we zoom out from this current moment to come back with new skills and inspiration. Next Friday, we're going to continue the series with a post-election reflection. It'll be less workshop and more of a discussion, but really talking about prompts to reflect individually and collectively about where do we want to be as a community, no matter the outcome. And then finally, we'll finish up this mini series with a teach-in for Organizing 101 on the 21st with 5 key leadership practices for organizing. Some of you have heard this, but the incentive I wanted to give folks is anyone who comes to all 3 sessions I will personally buy you a copy of this book. I just want to be very transparent because this book changed my life. And the quick backstory is that Marshall Gans was my teacher a decade ago. And this is like, this book just came out, but it's like his lifetime of wisdom, organizing in social movements and teaching social movements theory to students around the world for decades. So Marshall Gans is most well known for designing the grassroots strategy that got President Obama elected in the first place in 2008. But he began in the civil rights movement and worked with Cesar Chavez in the farm workers movement, and is just an amazing inspiration. And literally everything I learned in that class is in this book. So I am like happily trying to get it in the hands of as many people as I can. So you'll hear more about that, but just want to give a shout out now, and then we'll talk more about it later. Okay, bismillah. So we're gonna keep rolling. Okay, this, I'm gonna, oops, I have 2 slides going. So I basically don't wanna, I'm gonna move past this slide very quickly because I think it's more interesting for you to hear about a couple moments in my life that have brought me to doing this work today rather than like a formal bio. But for those who are really itching for a bio, here's like a couple bullet points. I've been working with democracy and civic engagement leaders for almost 15 years. around the world in many different countries and kind of started this work with activists in the Middle East, including in Egypt, where my family comes from before and after the Arab Spring, working with an organization called POMED. I want to give a special shout out because Radwan Masmoudi in the back there, I saw your name on the registration, is a old colleague and just a huge expert on all things Islam and democracy, literally running the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy, and was a huge partner in the early days, I mean, for many years, but also in the early days of Tunisia's revolution. I remember still the amazing leaders and politicians you introduced me to many years ago. So I'm really happy to see you here. Do you want to share anything? I know, like, again, this is a mixed crowd of, different backgrounds, but I'm really happy to see you here. So. Okay, sounds good. Yeah, we'll definitely have time for discussion, inshallah. Okay, so I've learned from people in the April 6th movement in Egypt. I've learned from people in the Otpor movement from Serbia. I've learned a lot from Marshall Gans and many open government leaders as well. And I was also on the board of a nonprofit called RISE, which trains social movement leaders around the world. So, but the more interesting thing, I think, is like telling you a bit about my journey in a few moments. Oh, thank you again. Yeah, I'm gonna need those reminders. Okay, so this is the part that I'm gonna have to be very brief, inshallah. But here, give me 1 second while we get this set up. Okay, because I have too much technology going on. But okay, so I'm gonna give you just again a couple quick moments, and I would love to have more conversation with you all. But the reason I'm telling you this in this way is because of this very powerful quote that I want you all to think about from Marshall Gans, from the practice of public narrative, which reminds us that like we have all experienced hardships, or we wouldn't think the world needs changing. And we've also all experienced sources of courage or motivation or hope, or we wouldn't think we could change it. This is a really powerful way to approach just the work of social change in general. And so I'm going to tell you now just a few very quick moments from my journey that speak to both the challenges and hope that I've experienced. Okay, so I feel like I had a kind of unlikely path to activism. So I was born and raised in Michigan, outside of Detroit. My parents are immigrants from Egypt, and they're engineering professors. And so I come from like a long line of engineers and doctors and nobody who ever studied politics, basically. My parents were very surprised when I became interested in this path. And I still remember, my 7th grade world history class, like really opened my eyes to how much passion I found for history and for policy and social change and all these things. And I was 12 years old when 9/11 happened. Like many of you, I'm sure, I grew up, I came of age very much in this environment of like headlines every day questioning different parts of my identity, right? This clash of civilizations between the West and the Muslim world. And I found myself like squarely in the middle. I was also a Sunday school dropout, fun fact, because once I became a teenager, right around this time, there were no other kids my age. So my sisters had this like amazing youth group who they're older than me. But, by the time I was a teenager, there were no other kids my age, so I dropped out. But the good thing was it propelled me to like read the Quran for myself for the first time in my life and like really engage with my faith, not just because I was born into it, but because I came to it on my own terms. So I remember finding these like tremendous calls for social justice and really being confused about why I wasn't hearing more of that, both in like the media and popular discourse, but also within other Muslim spaces. Maybe we would talk about charity sometimes, but it felt like we would never talk about justice. So I realized time and again, right, like day after day, so many people, especially trying to speak on behalf of Muslim women, that like, even though I was a very shy kid and had no interest in any kind of spotlight, I was like, okay, clearly if I don't start speaking for myself, other people are going to keep speaking for people like me, right? So then I moved away for college to Michigan State University. First time I left my like comfortable suburban upbringing, and encountered a hate group on our campus. This happened to be 2006 and 7 in Michigan State, where our university had the only hate group in the country that was listed on the Southern Poverty Law Center's like annual watch of hate groups. It was the only student organization on that list that year. They were particularly insane, is what I'm trying to tell you. And they had like shady money to bring the most hateful, bigoted speakers you can imagine. So I remember one day, like walking out of my dorm. I had just started to wear hijab, by the way, right before college. Walking out of my dorm and seeing this group had chalked these messages like catch the illegal immigrants and kill the Islamic terrorists. And it was just bonkers, right? So I was like, okay, again, like clearly if we need to do something here. And the beautiful thing was like we grew a diverse coalition in response to this hateful minority of extreme far right white nationalists. And we changed policies and cultures on our campus. And I think left a legacy. And I remember it's so funny too, because again, my parents could not really understand like why are you studying what you're studying? Why are you doing what you're doing? But I remember one day I was part of a protest and that photo was on the front page of our campus newspaper. And then I found my mom actually sharing that photo with like all of our relatives in Egypt. It was one of the first times I was like, oh, I think you might be proud of me, even like about this, even though you're very confused about why I'm doing what I'm doing. So so that was a nice turning point. And alhamdulillah, they've like really come along with me on this journey ever since. And I remember sitting in an MSA lecture one day, listening to Dawood Walid, who ran the CARE chapter in Michigan, speaking about Surah Al-Ma'un, for example, which warns believers who pray, but who are neglectful of our obligations to our neighbors, and who لا يحضون على طعام المسكين, not those who don't feed the poor, but those who don't advocate on behalf of feeding the poor. Like I remember hearing that lecture and being like, wow, like there's something here again to our tradition and how it's not just a nice to have, but it's really part of our faith-based practice to be advocates, not only in service of others. Okay, so I'm gonna shorten it up a little bit now. But I wanted to put a few photos because again, Netta the activist was kind of born on campus in the midst of this hate group and the ways that we were able to overcome them. And then I started my career working with activists in the Arab Spring before and after the movements in Egypt and Tunisia and Libya and elsewhere. And so these are a few photos from when I was in Tahrir Square in 2011, where I got tear gassed with my boss, Steve. Fun stories. Happy to talk to you more about them later. But one of the reasons I chose this photo is because I'll never forget this moment where this, Egyptian guy probably didn't have a lot of means, was collecting the tear gas canisters in Tahrir Square. And those canisters, if you zoom in real close, say made in Pennsylvania. And I remember I had like a kind of nice SLR camera that I had just brought with me on this trip. And he saw my camera and he pulled me over and he said, come take a photo of this. And then when he found out that I was an Egyptian American, he said, I need you to take this back with you. I need you to take these photos. And that was one of the first moments that I was like, okay, we as Americans have a particular obligation, not only to care about social justice causes at home, but the ways in which we're complicit and involved and connected to causes in other parts of the world. Okay, and then the last photo, again, I'm talking about some moments of challenge, but I'll wrap this up in just a minute. This photo is from Khalil, the city of Abraham, Hebron, and this is when I visited Israel, Palestine 10 years ago with a group of students in my grad school program. There was like 100 of us, and we went to learn about the occupation. And to this day, like Khalil is still the most absurd place I've ever been to in my life. Like I struggle to find the words to describe the ways in which the occupation has particularly manifested in this place. And the reason I chose this photo, which still disturbs me quite a lot, is there's a banner that we saw and on the streets that says Palestine never existed and never will, right? Because there's a very active settler movement in this city, and there's Palestinian families who have been there for many, many years who are literally, prevented from walking their own streets that they can look down upon from their apartments and all kinds of things. And I obviously, I think, we're many of us are here thinking about what we can do to end the genocide. But the reason I wanted to bring this again is just as a quick reminder, obviously, that the occupation of Palestine didn't begin yesterday, and I don't think it will end tomorrow. But again, how can we take the long view about what are we doing day after day, week after week, to build our power and our resources and our skills to make changes on the things that we care about most? Okay, the last quick moment, because I know I'm talking a lot about myself, but we're gonna jump into the content in 1 second. The last moment I want to bring you to is another moment from many years ago, but this was when I was still working with activists in the Middle East, and the last thing I did in that first job was organize a workshop with about 50 people who came from like 9 different countries across the Arab world, and they were all creating new like watchdog organizations and think tanks in the midst of these huge political transformations. Um, and we worked so hard to like design all these great workshops and trainings for them and everything. But I'll never forget at the very end of the training, one of we were talking about everything we did together in this little beach town in Egypt, and one of the participants stood up and said, like, thank you, because we were thirsty for these connections. And he wasn't actually talking about the things that we had trained them on specifically. He was talking about the relationships he had with other people in the room now and how he could go back home. I think he was from Jordan, this particular activist, and feel stronger and empowered by the solidarity that he felt from the relationships he had built with people in other countries. And so that's like the through line that brings me to the work that I'm doing today now in another global network. It's the biggest thing that gives me hope for the future is the power of solidarity between people who are in different contexts but have the same values and who can inspire each other and inform each other about different ways to approach the problems they care about most. Okay, end of that story time. So happy to again like share more about these things later, but I want to move us into the content. And again, I hope one of the takeaways you get from that little segment is the power of telling stories of our personal experiences that bring us to why we do what we do, both the challenges and the sources of motivation and hope that we find. So all right. So part of how this particular workshop was developed, this is just a little sampling of some of the books that I have at home, real photo I took this week, that have kind of informed this particular workshop. And it's the first time I'm ever sharing it. I hope it will be useful to each of you and also to maybe other audiences that I'd love to share it with in the future. Okay, so just before we get into the content, just a quick thumbs up if you're feeling pretty clear about like what I'm hoping to achieve today, why I took a little bit of time to tell you about where I'm at, where we headed. Okay, yeah, feeling pretty good. Alhamdulillah. Simon's giving me a frowny face.
No, I'm just trying to make out.
Oh, it's a thinking face. Okay,
I'm all
good.
in.
Good. And I'm gonna share these slides afterwards. So again, make sure you've registered for this event. Make sure you sign into the clipboard if you want the book, if you come to all the sessions, the Marshall Gans book, etc. But okay, so basically now for the next little less than a half hour, I'm gonna share kind of 10 key lessons about what makes social movements succeed, inshallah. So, and again, sorry, I'm going through two slides. Okay, the first thing I want to do is debunk a couple like common misperceptions that you often hear people say, whether directly or indirectly, when we think about social movements. The first thing that is really powerful when you look at the research, which I'll get more into in a second, is that actually nonviolence is a consistently more effective strategy for social movements for change than violent means. And including and especially when movements stay committed to nonviolence, even in the face of extreme repression. And we'll talk a little bit about this idea of like making repression backfire. But I just want you to kind of like take that point as point number one. Okay, point number two. Unfortunately, again, especially I think in media coverage, we can sometimes be misled into thinking that effective movements are spontaneous, right? It was just like this swarm of people woke up one day and realized we don't want this dictator anymore. Like that never happens, right? So, and especially in the age of social media, like we can see obviously how social media tools can be useful, but how there's also limitations to those tools. So again, I've never seen or heard of any movement that led to sustained social change that was spontaneous in the last century in particular of movements. So we can talk about that. Oftentimes they have quite a long strategy and quite a lot of planning and coordination that we'll get into. And then the third kind of common myth I think that we encounter a lot is that movements are based on one charismatic leader, right? So unfortunately, the way many of us are taught about movements in school, whether it's civil rights or the end of the British occupation of India or the end of the apartheid of South Africa, you name it, yes, there are important figures in history that we can learn from, but the most effective movement leaders have always made the movement about other people and not themselves. And frankly, I think one of the best things that leaders can do is inspire, help people see their own potential and their own power, right? I think we can talk about President Obama if you're interested, but I think that's like one of the things that is that was part of his legacy, is thinking again about how leaders can be symbols basically for us, how they can remind us about the potential that we have within us and between us when we come together. So, all right, we're going to move pretty fast. I'm going to try to spend just a couple minutes on each of these 10 key lessons. Do like interrupt me if something makes absolutely no sense, so I can make sure to clarify that. And then we will definitely have time for discussion, inshallah. So, okay, so that's a little bit about what doesn't work. And now I want to get into what does work. So a lot of this particular session is really hinged on this beautiful book. I didn't bring a hard copy of it today, but one of my mentors named Maria Stefan co-wrote this book with Erica Chenoweth, and it was kind of a game changer, I think, for a lot of political scientists, because basically what they did was study hundreds of movements. I don't remember the exact final number, but of movements for social change across the entire 20th century. And they basically found that there were three ingredients to successful movements across the 20th century, across so many different countries, and movements with different goals. Some of these movements were to topple dictators, some of them were to remove foreign occupiers, like they were in different contexts, but across the board, they did this kind of rigorous political science analysis and came out with three takeaways. And one of the biggest and most important takeaways from this book is that the most successful movements have a broad base of people. They are not powered by only one group of people in society. They include many different segments of society who find a way to come together around a common goal. Even more specifically, they found a really interesting trend in the data, which was something that some people refer to as the 3.5% rule. Has anyone heard of this before? Raise your hand if it's familiar. Okay, so you can look it up because it's quite powerful. But again, it all comes from this research and this book. The 3.5% rule was a very fascinating finding that when you look again across hundreds of movements over a 100-year period, almost every single movement that was successful had hit a tipping point of engaging 3.5% of the population of that country. And of course, this varies depending on the size of the country. If you're wondering, here for us in the United States, that's about 14, 15 million people, to reach 3.5% as a critical mass, where again, a tipping point was reached and some of the movement goals started to be achieved when they had achieved that level of popular support. So we could talk about this for days. I'm really giving you like the flyover, summary of this. So, but again, if I really encourage you to like dig more into the resources that you hear about today that you're most interested in, inshallah. But the 3.5% rule and broad-based coalitions. And I'm going to try to like give you the concept and then give you some examples for each of these points. So one of my favorite examples that speaks to this point, I learned from the leaders who toppled Serbia's dictator, Slobodan Milosevic, in the year 2000. Okay, so they're like a wonderful group of like ragtag, cool Serbians who are now like in their 40s and 50s, and some of whom are, have trained other movements around the world, but they were basically a bunch of kids who toppled the dictator. How did they do it? Again, there's a bunch of amazing resources. There's a great film about this particular story, but their movement was called Otpor, okay? And so many people in the world at that time had looked at the Balkans, looked at countries like Serbia, and saw just brutal repression, right? And they were pretty isolated from other countries and everything. But they had a strategy, and the strategy had a lot of elements. Thank you so much. And one of my favorite examples that they, and sorry, I should just tell you for full disclosure, I took a class with them. When I was a grad student at Harvard, that was literally like how to topple a dictator. And we did it in the middle of Boston's snowiest winter ever in history. It just felt like such a great subversive act. I was like hanging out with these Serbs. And anyway, who were referred to in Egyptian media as like, oh, these crazy, violent, radical Serbians are training our young people, when they're actually like the best practitioners of nonviolence that you can think of. So again, I have stories if you want to come talk to me about stories later. But the example that I'm going to bring now is to think about how successful movements give people many options to engage and recognize that the things that young people can do, for example, the risks that young people can take are not the same risks that everybody necessarily can take. It's not feasible for everybody to put their body on the line in protest that could, cause harm or worse, right? So one of the many strategies that Otpor did was every day at like 6 p.m., this dictator, Milosevic, had state-sponsored propaganda on the TV. It was like the nightly news program, and everybody knew that it was complete BS, but it was on the news media, right? Because they had controlled that institution. And so every day at 6 p.m. in the capital city of Belgrade, the Otpor movement had organized people to bang on pots and pans when that nightly news program came on. And it was clearly an act of resistance, but it was something that literally grandmothers could do. And I want you to think again about the ways in which movements can reach people where they are and the power that you can feel when you engage in an action that shows you that you're not alone, right? So just the act of banging on pots and pan, when you hear just complete nonsense being spewed on the TV, it was an act of resistance. It was a way that normal, everyday people who did not like that leader could show their objection, but they could also hear it from their neighbors. And this was something that they did over a period of months, right? And they engaged in many other actions. But I want to just like zoom in on that one little simple example because it speaks to the principle of giving many people an entry point to engage with your movement. Yes.
Sorry, questions aren't from that. That's also fine. But I was curious with the 3.5% rule. I'm sure there's a lot of research. Is there anything you can point out on how they measure that? Is that like, I don't know, popular opinion, like polls and media? Is it? Yeah, I'm curious, like what that looks like.
Yeah. Let me, I think let's put it in the parking lot, actually. I think it was Aisha. Are you, no, who's our parking?
Yeah.
No, okay. Is it Yusuf? Do you mind just making note of that for later, like going deeper into the 3.5% rule? Thank you. Thanks for the question, Sana. Okay, we're gonna keep moving. Again, this is like lightning speed crash course. Okay, I referred to this a little bit earlier, but thank you again. I'm sorry, I keep doing this. Okay, point number 2, we talked a little bit about it before, but nonviolent discipline. So again, the same research from the same book called Why Civil Resistance Works found that movements that stayed nonviolent, even in the face of repression, were 2 times as likely to fulfill their own goals as movements that became violent. Yeah. I want to keep talking, but I'm aware of time, and I just want to introduce this idea of like the ways in which activists can strategically make violence backfire. And I don't know about you all, right? But like 6 months ago, when there were images, from across the country of activists, student activists calling for the end of the occupation of Palestine and the end of the genocide, and the images that many of us saw of the police brutality that they received was a mobilizing moment for a lot of people, right? Because we all have because even people who might be otherwise consumed by other issues in their everyday lives can see like the overt injustice of that situation, right? So again, I'm gonna keep moving for the sake of time, but this is a trend that you can find in a lot of other movements across history. Is like preparing for doing your best to take care of your people, but also being strategic about kind of bringing attention to extreme cases of kind of the backlash and making kind of the oppressor's violence backfire. I hope that makes sense. Okay, we're gonna keep moving, you guys. Sorry, it's a lot. Okay, key ingredient number 3. Again, it comes from the same. I'm so sorry, you guys. Okay, I think this will work. I think this will work. Okay, so number 3 most common ingredient, again from like this massive study of a century of social movements plus many other sources, a few of which I mentioned here, is that movements are well planned. And specifically they plan for the day after, right? Not only for what happens when you achieve like the initial goal to remove an unjust leader or a corrupt leader or whatever it might be, but also for what happens after the day after that happens. And this is part of the criticism that a lot of people have about what happens in Arab Spring movements 1 year, 2 year, 3 years, 10 years after corrupt leaders were taken from power. So this is really one of the most kind of decisive ingredients to, again, what differentiates successful movements from those who have less success. I'm going to give you two very quick examples just to let this idea simmer. One example from Egypt, again, I just mentioned, was the April 6th movement, which was a very key movement of young people that contributed to the Arab Spring of 2011 and removing Hosni Mubarak from power. The name of their movement comes from April 6, 2008, which was the date of a labor strike in Mahalla, in a kind of outskirt of Cairo, that they had organized. And again, we can talk at length about what this means, but it's one of many, many reminders that, again, massive social change doesn't happen overnight, and it can often take years and decades and more. But having long-term strategies can empower movements for success. Yeah, okay. The grape boycott of the farm workers movement from Cesar Chavez in California, as well as another example of this. The only thing I want to say about this for now, just to get some thoughts flowing, is that this was not the grape and the apples and the oranges and the mangoes boycott. This was a grape boycott, and it took 4 years, but eventually it succeeded. And so it's really important that we think about how are we being strategic and being targeted in our efforts, not biting off more than we can chew, so that we can see progress over time. Okay. And there's an entire book called Why David Sometimes Wins, if you're interested to learn more about the farm workers movement, as one other example. All right, next, point number 4. Oof, this is I realize we're covering a lot, but we're doing okay on time. So point number 4, another successful ingredient for social movements is that they are well coordinated. Again, across different people who also not only have different backgrounds, young and old, rich and poor, labor and business, but they're also they are coordinated across different approaches, like an inside game and an outside game, calling in people versus calling out people. I think the history of the civil rights movement here in the United States is a really powerful example, and we can look at it from many different perspectives. But we had Martin and we had Malcolm, and it was really important that that there were multiple strategies happening that were actually moving people in the same direction, even as they spoke to different specific tactics at different times. Same thing with Tunisia's Jasmine Revolution that prompted the entire, Arab Spring across the region back in late 2010 and 2011. I think this was a few years back, there was a group of leaders called the Quartet that won the Nobel Peace Prize for, again, kind of their efforts to unite each other to come together and remove a dictator. Even as, again, Tunisia's struggles still continue, like many of these struggles continue today. But the Quartet specifically was a group of leaders, again, across like students and human rights, lawyers and business, labor and others, again, coming together around these unified causes. Okay, gonna keep rolling. As we continue, again, I've referred to like at least one book for each of these points. So if there's certain points, again, that you're particularly curious about, I encourage you to kind of make note of these resources, and we can get into it more deeply. Okay, point number 5, really important little thing to keep in our toolbox is this idea of pillars of support. Is this familiar to anyone? This is really powerful stuff, and it actually comes from a number of different sources. But the very basic idea here is that every system is propped by different pillars of support in the society, right? Systems for good and systems for evil. And so if you are trying to combat an unjust system, it's really important to break down where is that system getting its support. Whether the system, the thing at the top of the pillar, is one dictator or one lobby or whatever it might be, systems are held up by pillars of support. And in many cases, effective social movement tactics have broken down these pillars of support and found ways to basically pull people slowly away from these different pillars. So So this is what is often referred to in like this nonviolent, civil resistance literature as defections. Okay, right? What happens when people who are clear, like leaders, influential people within different pillars of society, whether it's business, courts, media, educational institutions, whatever, what happens when they start to speak out against the status quo, right? It can really it can create a lot of momentum for change. So there's so much power to think about, like breaking down the sources of power for any system that you're trying to change, and then thinking about how to peel people away from those pillars, kind of one by one, step by step, as part of a bigger, longer term strategy. And often what we're trying to do, this graphic on the right gets into this a little bit, is, it's unrealistic to expect uh, you know, the majority of people to kind of hugely change their mind overnight about a cause if they haven't already cared about it, right? But a lot of the nuance of the strategy, but in a lot of social movements, comes down to how do we move people not from like active opposition to active allies of our cause. No, that's going to be really hard, right? But how do we move them just one step to the left? Like, how do we turn the dial one to be, if they're active opposition, how do we make them passive opposition? How do we reduce the impact of their support for this unjust system that we're trying to change, rather than like driving ourselves crazy by trying to make the people upholding the system who are diehard proponents of it become like us overnight? It's a really important principle, I think, to keep thinking about how do we apply this to our own context in different ways. Okay. Point number 5. We're gonna keep rolling. Yeah. Temperature check. Are people feeling like terribly antsy, or you're mostly with me? Thumbs up is good. Thumbs down is like, I have no idea what's going on. And in the middle is, I have some questions. Okay, good. Alhamdulillah. All right. Principle number 6 is diversify your tactics. This is something I've thought about a lot, especially over the last year. And I really, really hope is one of the key take-home messages for all of us today, is to remember that, again, when you're trying to build an effective strategy to make big change, serious change on any cause, it's really important to use different approaches. Um, one of the brilliant scholars basically of civil resistance over the last century is this guy named Gene Sharp, who wrote a bunch of great books. They're all amazing. You should read all of them if you're into this. But in the 1970s, he again did a bunch of research looking at a bunch of movements and created a list of 198 tactics for civil resistance. And you can find it online. I thought about printing it today, but decided not to. And some of the tactics might not speak to you. That's not the point. But the point is to remember that there are hundreds of tactics that we can use as one move in a broader game of chess, right? Or as one step in a broader, longer term strategy. And especially like if we're playing a long game, because things don't happen overnight, it's really important to think about what are the different tactics that we want to use for the different, more specific and immediate goals that we're trying to achieve, right? And if and protest cannot be the only option is something else that I want to say, right? Like, especially again, we want to break it down to the specific goals in the specific time, but like, especially if you're using the same tactic over and over again and not seeing results, why would you keep using the same tactic? I think that's a really, really important take home message. And there's a kind of fun little quote that you can use to try to remember this, which again, I learned from these wonderful Serbian leaders from the Otpor movement, one of whom is named Srđa Popović and wrote this other amazing book. This is a very readable book, by the way. This is not like scholarly academic. This is really a quick and amazing inspirational read. So I highly recommend it. The subtitle is How to Use Rice Pudding, Lego Men, and Other Nonviolent Techniques to Galvanize Communities, Overthrow Dictators, or Simply Change the World. He's a really funny guy, actually, Srđa Popović, and again, was one of my teachers 10 years ago. And he often says that movements are like sharks. Okay, does anyone know what's the weird thing about sharks compared to other fish? Like, do you know what this might be referring to? They die if, yeah. Yes. I'm not a biologist, but I did Google this last night to make sure it kind of is true, and it seems to be true. Yes, exactly. Sharks don't have a swim bladder like other fish, so they actually need to like keep moving, generally speaking, to survive. And movements are the same. Movements need to keep moving to survive. they should not become predictable. Otherwise, you make it easier for your opponents to overcome, right? Okay, so keep moving to survive. So point number 7. I have bad news and good news on this slide. The bad news is that really bad evil leaders and dictators are becoming more sophisticated. When you look at, again, and study and research like autocratic leaders in the 21st century compared to the 20th century, there's a big difference. They are becoming more subtle and more sophisticated, right? Rarely will you find a world leader today, even in the most repressive places, who just like rounds up people and eliminates them. Rarely. More often, you will find sophisticated misinformation campaigns and like death by 1,001 cuts, right? Which is like the Putin example in Russia, for example. It was like the very slow bureaucratic takeover of an entire government. So we need to be aware of this, number one. But number two, again, like I referred to earlier, we can still make oppression backfire. And there's a really brilliant book, one of the first books I ever read on this topic, by Will Dobson, called The Dictator's Learning Curve from 2012. This basically shines a spotlight on, again, these movements of oppression, but also the movements of resistance against them. And the hope and the potential that comes from the creative tactics that people are finding to adapt to these more sophisticated forms of repression. Again, like all of the insane like McCarthyism that we're living through now, like the smear campaigns, the doxing, the you name it, like ways to pull people down who are speaking out against injustices is very terrifying. and again, our opponents have more sophisticated tools to do this, but so do we, right? And again, I think we can be empowered by these lessons from history and from different times and places to respond in more creative ways to these kind of more sophisticated forms of silencing dissent. Okay. We are almost there, and then we're going to take a nice big fat break to discuss. Okay, point number 8, when we look at successful movements, is that these movements, like I said before, kind of meet people where they are, and they focus on persuasion and not shaming people into change. So, please raise your hand if you've ever changed a behavior because someone shamed you into doing it, like made you feel so bad about it that you were just like, fine, I'm gonna do it. Anyone? Okay, yeah, maybe 1 or 2. That's fine. We don't have to talk about it. I appreciate your honesty. But I'm guessing you probably didn't feel so great about it, whatever the outcome was. I think about this when I think about hijab, frankly, and how I've often told people I get so frustrated when people force women to do things in a certain way, whether it's their governments or their family members or whoever, because they're inevitably taking away the benefit that a individual person might get if they came to that decision on their own. So that's a little footnote. But the point is that like this is really powerful, actually. Like, please don't ever believe someone who tells you that like the way to change the world is like to convince people with good arguments, because that's never the whole story, right? The heart is the seat of motivation for all human beings. And actually emotions and feelings really matter, like whether or not you're aware of it. Again, great movements for good and great movements for evil have found ways to tap into people's feelings, not just their heads, right? Their hearts, not just their heads. This is a really key part of, again, like the kind of organizing building blocks that I've learned from Marshall Gans, which you can find now in this book. It's please don't dismiss the power, again, of people's feelings and the ways in which we can uncover values when we engage with emotions, actually. Because again, like all of us are, as human beings, are motivated by not just the things that we understand in our heads, but the things that we feel in our hearts. And that connects to the actions that we take with our hands. So that's one of the exercises I have for us in the second part of this workshop, is to think about kind of that head, hand, heart triangle and where are we at in our own journeys right now as activists, as community members, and how we can move people to change. So really another really important point I hope you take away, and this is a quick elaboration on that. Again, you'll find these graphs in the book, and in you can yeah, as well, but we're connecting the head, hand, and heart. I know this image might not be super clear, but we're thinking about stories, which move our hearts. We're thinking about strategy, which connect to how we engage with our heads, and how does that motivate people to actually take action, right? Because at the end of the day, we might feel good about like sending certain messages out into the world. But if we're serious about this long arc of social change, then we have to think about how do we actually change people's behaviors into, again, supporting the things that we know are most important. Um, there's, again, a big differentiator between movements that win and movements that lose is whether or not they channel people's feelings towards action or towards apathy, right? Certain emotions can paralyze us. This is normal. This is human nature. So if you are making me feel isolated, if you're making me feel afraid, like beyond reason, I will probably freeze as just a normal human being. Like these emotions can freeze us in terms of our actions. But the flip side of these emotions can also propel us to act, right? So if I find a way to yes, have outrage about injustices, but also remind people about sources of hope, I am a lot more likely, again, to move people into action than if they feel overwhelmed, isolated, apathetic, etc. So really, really important piece of this as well. Oops. Okay, last 2 points before we break for discussion. This is related to the last couple slides, but obviously like our messages do matter, again, because of how we want to engage people in the head, hand, and the heart. And depending on the cause, right, it's so important to understand, frankly, like public messaging research, right? If we go back to that spectrum that I showed you earlier, if I'm trying to move people 1 degree to the left towards my cause, what are the messages that will, resonate with people compared to ones that won't? A quick example that I'll share here is from a movement called Represent Us. They are kind of at the forefront of the movement to fight corruption in the United States, in our political systems. And I really, really recommend if you're interested, they have this, it's like a 15-minute documentary called Unbreaking America that kind of breaks down like how our system has become so broken, but also what we can do about it. And part of their work, again, has found that like when you hit people on the head with like terms about like institutional reform and representative democracy, like cool, they'll probably be asleep before you finish your pitch, right? But actually, corruption is quite a unifying human concern. Again, I challenge you to find me somewhere in the world that the majority of people of that society don't dislike corruption. Like it's actually pretty sure it's impossible, right? So like most people suffer from corruption, whether it's grand corruption, whether it's petty corruption, whether it's overt, whether it's hidden. Like people aren't down with corruption. So therefore, how do we understand that issue, but then also break it down in a way that meets people where they are. And again, doesn't shame them into like, you should know better. You should know the history of the Electoral College, whatever, insert argument here. Like the point is, if I'm trying to make you to like act, move you towards action, then let's have a conversation that taps into your own values and the shared values that we have. And a lot of this comes to life in a beautiful, beautiful practice called public narrative. It's one of the 5 skills for organizers, which again is in this book and is part of the 3rd workshop that I'll be doing on the 21st, inshallah. It is about stories of self, what brings me to this work, stories of us, what are the values that we share, and stories of now, what is the urgent problem that we actually can take action on. It's like the whole, all of these principles really come to life in public narrative. And one of my favorite things to do on earth is teach people and coach people public narrative. So inshallah, I hope the session on the 21st is just the beginning of going deeper onto this. So, okay, almost done at 2:15 here. Point number 10 in this flyover summary of 10 lessons for successful social movements is like, it all comes back to people. And there's a few numbers we can kind of keep in mind when we're trying to build any organizing strategy for any cause that we may care about. The first number is I don't know, some people may call it this, but basically is like the number of people you can have at a dinner table in one conversation. Does anyone want to guess how many people can you have in one conversation, generally speaking? 6 to 8. You can shout it out. Yeah.
5.
4 or 5. Yeah. Yeah. So, again, it may differ depending on context, but generally speaking, it is extremely hard, if not impossible, to have one conversation with more than 12 people. Like that's kind of a threshold. And therefore there's a logic for when you design teams that are part of movements to to do anything to change the world, right? Like if there's more than 12 people, you lose accountability, right? Because if someone doesn't show up that week, like maybe we notice them, maybe we don't. This is actually very deliberately part of our design of Center DC's small groups, which alhamdulillah I've been organizing now for many years. Like it's really hard to have, again, a group of people commit to each other over any period of time if there's more than 12 of them. And like maybe, anywhere between like 4 to 12 is an interesting range to build a team that can do things together because they are in real relationship with each other. It's not just like I'm liking a message here and then I'm running off and living my life. No, it's like we are in relationship with each other. We make commitments to each other for our collective actions. So part of that is visualized up here. I know this is a really small graph, but it comes from one of the resources that I'll share with you at the end called the Commons Library. And it just breaks down different structures of movement campaigns. The snowflake model is something that, again, was instrumental in the campaign that got President Obama elected as our first Black president in 2008. It's part of Marshall Ganz's work, but there's, other variations of this. But what I'm trying to draw your attention to is like each circle is a person. And if each person in the movement is actually in a committed form of engagement with 3, 4, 5, 6, 8 other people, like that's where all social change lives. Like there's that famous quote, right? That like whatever, never doubt the power of a small group of people. What is it? To change the world. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, no one else has ever changed.
Margaret Mead, is that right? Yeah, I think that's the source. Exactly. Like it really does all come back to like human beings in relationship, making commitments to make a change. And relationships can grow exponentially, which is part of what you see on this image. So I'll skip a piece here, but I just want to remind us too that again, technology can be a blessing to build relationships. It can also be a curse, and it can and Zainab Tuf, I never know how to say her last name. I used to know. Anyway, she's an amazing, brilliant scholar about like digital activism, and this is an amazing book if you're interested in the intersection of again social media and digital activism. It's called Twitter and Tear Gas, but to fetch, yes, she's very Turkish, yes. And last time I heard her speak, by the way, she, as she comes from a country that has had multiple military coups and has, dealt with different forms of repression, she was speaking to an audience of Americans, and she was like, I've seen this movie before, right? Like what's happening in America, our decline of democracy and the rise of kind of authoritarian influence in this country was like very familiar to her. And she was like, it's as if I'm watching a horror movie and I'm like, don't go into the basement. Like I've been like, I know what you're talking about, and please trust me, I've been there before, right? And I'm sure a lot of people like, my family and others who have lived through like repressive environments can see the warning signs. And again, that's a lot of the work that I've done in the last several years is like help Americans listen to our friends in other countries and be like, what did you see? What did you experience? What were the warning signs and what gave you hope? Like this is all part of, again, where I think we can build real strength and solidarity.
Her last name ironically means musket or rifle maker.
Yeah. I've heard this. It's like ironic that, yeah, her last name means something. Anyway, so long story short, again, this is the point I want to end on is, I really think, again, any good organizer, any good activist always starts with one simple question. It's not what is your issue, what is your cause? It's who are your people? Because like there's no other way to like actually make sustained social change. And that's honestly how I came to like make this presentation too. I've been like for many months actually thinking about how do I make sense of my role in this political moment and the things that I know and the things that I want to change. And I was like, you know what, Center DC are my people. Like, let me come back to my people. Let me get back to basics because I don't have all the answers and I have been so disappointed by so many things and felt so much heartbreak in the last several months. And I know that like this is my community. Y'all are my people. We are each other's people. And it like literally all starts with what happens in this room. So That's fun cliffhanger. We are gonna take a pause and discuss. I realize I've thrown so much at you. I'm really excited to hear your thoughts, and I have three exercises that we can that I've brought for today. My goal is maybe only that we cover two of them for today, but I'm gonna stop talking. This is what we're gonna do. Because I'm sure you probably have a lot of thoughts. I want you to just get in groups of three and just talk for the next, like, just 6 minutes. It won't be long, about what is the most surprising or striking thing that you've just heard. Cool? And then we'll come back. Yeah, sound good, inshallah? Okay, so again, just a quick introduction and each person, like, what's the biggest thing that's surprising you we've shared?
No, I did, but I was like.
Thanks for the photos too. Yeah, I was hoping.
Oh, yeah, you know? You wanted the last
I do like a
Media all sides.
I know you said, I know you didn't find that, but I'm not, so like, I guess it'll be.
When you're in yeah, so it's really.
Oh, yeah. Cool, thank Also, like,
That's why your brain doesn't even look like Basically, there's a lot. I feel like when you talk something like the concept, I feel like it's life I'm hearing about it. So like I also like from out the national for my son, right? Like it's readily there's a lot of issues that are virtually not talking about in the public life, right? The idea that you make across the world what are different methods that have been done to solve those things, and then across the country that share these kinds of and the like.
It's like a strategy, like a part of it. I just hard to make like I was like, oh, it's funny. Example, but then this, like, how would you respond? Like, I feel like there's so much cool stuff you can do again. Like, it's engaging and it's learning. Like, yeah, it's basically something. There's, yeah, it's yeah.
I was supposed to be. Oh, I think for a moment, I was like, it's kind of almost there. I was
We ready to come back? Want to stop here? We got okay, bismillah. So, it's 2:30 and I want to invite us to do a couple exercises as well before we finish, but I would love to hear I'm taking a note from Osama's playbook. Like I feel like the model he's been using of small group discussion has been really useful. So I would love to hear just like for one person from each group, not to summarize all the points. I know that's always tempting, but to share back just one like takeaway that you're getting from your conversation. Yeah, Harris, go ahead.
So yeah, so we're talking about and I think a few things came out of it. There was a realization about for the long term, something that we focus on down.
Yeah.
Forget about the next thing. That's true. But then another issue that happened too was I think brought up was the importance of feelings and emotions, the story aspect.
Yeah.
Not necessarily in order to maybe persuade people, not using necessarily logic and so forth,
Yeah.
but also keeping in mind feelings as well too.
Cool.
That was something very in depth that's kind of being discussed.
Cool. Thank you. That's super helpful. Awesome. Cool. Yes, Yusuf.
One thing was first I think the bit on like meeting people where they're at is really important and not shaming. And like I emphasis on persuading, like building relationships with people is really important with there. And then we had a question around what like specifically with regards to the violence and non-violence bit, like
Yeah.
what is the definition of a social movement? Because the what we were discussing is how there are numerous like national liberation struggles would look to like Haiti or Vietnam,
Yeah.
Algeria, where They had to because of conditions of colonialism. So I was wondering if there's a distinction between the social movements we're talking about and like those experiences in history.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of discussion centered around that
Amazing.
question.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for that. I'll address that really quickly because again, I wish I had I probably brought the copy of Why Civil Resistance Works. Because again, that's the book that looks at over 300 movements, and in their research, most of those were movements for regime change. So like changing the political structure, again, whether it was to get rid of foreign occupiers or, you know, other leaders, etc. So yeah, so again, I'm happy to talk more about that. But I think to your point also about our definition of movements, I'm really glad you asked. And I thought about having a bunch of definition slides earlier. But what I want to invite us to think about, especially in the next couple sessions, is the difference between mobilizing and organizing. And I'm sure, again, I know some of you in the room are like very seasoned activists, and this is such an important distinction because, again, it comes back to this final point about relationships for change and how we can, how we can, you know, we can get people to take discrete actions relatively easily, especially again with social media and all kinds of stuff, sign this petition, forward this email, call your senator, etc. But those actions to kind of mobilize people around something will not be effective if they're not part of a larger strategy, right? So again, it is impossible to organize without relationships. And so that's where I want to bring us to again here, because it's a really important distinction. So happy to talk more about that, but thank you for the report out, Yusuf. Cool. Others? Yeah.
Our group was really captivated by the 3.5%
Yeah.
metric. Because it's like almost hard to believe. Something that came up was kind of, well, first it's like hopeful because even if you don't get there immediately, there's a hope that okay, if we eventually reach this goal, we'll be able to accomplish our change. But then like thought that I had was, you know, I get that if there's like a dictator, there's not like grassroots organizing the other direction. But nowadays when I think about like right-wing white nationalism, there is like a counter movement of people trying to organize.
Yes.
So what does that mean if we get 3.5%, they get 3.5%? Then like what happens?
I think you've just hit the nail on the head of like this protracted political crisis that we're living through right now. Yes, exactly. It's like, and it's, you can look at a bajillion studies, about not just people's political affiliation, conservative, liberal, moderate, party affiliation, but also again, like how Americans respond to opinion polls on a lot of issues. And you'll find a lot of this, gridlock basically. But what I think is really important, something I found myself in a lot of conversations about over the last several years doing this work, is like the opponents of social justice, like the far right, the white nationalists, the pro-authoritarian movement is well coordinated. Like I can give you examples of when, far right American Republican congressmen have gone to Hungary because they worship Viktor Orban as like a beautiful example of a populist autocrat that they want to see in America. Like I can give you 101 examples, but what I'm trying to say is like I often feel that the kind of anti-democracy, pro-authoritarian movement is quite well coordinated in a 21st century way that connects people across countries to learn from each other. And so we, on the other side, really need to get our house in order and like be doing more of the same. Yeah.
Sure.
Sure.
I was kind of just thinking, I came in late unfortunately, but I guess I was thinking on the right, like how, because they're probably using the similar tactics, right, in order to organize.
I mean, it's a big topic. Like, I think it depends on, what we're talking about, but part of the, I'm not sure how to put it exactly, but I think, again, there's something to be said about nonviolent discipline that actually is quite a differentiator if you're talking about like a lot of the current political challenges that we're living through, and what does it mean to like basically win more people to your side because you actually have the moral high ground because you stay dedicated to nonviolence in the face of overt repression. Like that's part of again a theme that comes out of this whole body of literature is like making oppression backfire. When you see young women, you know, put roses in the barrels of the guns of the soldiers, you know, at the protest, like it's an image you don't forget. Like I'm trying to like, you know, make us think about, yeah, those very powerful ways. And you can look again at so many movements, the Tiananmen Square footage, the, you know, like those were tipping points when like a lot of relatively normal people who were like not politically engaged, people like my parents, whatever, they're living their lives, they're just trying to take care of themselves and their family, but then they see certain examples of like extreme contrast and they're like, wait a minute, that's not like that's not cool. So anyway, we can say a lot more, but I do want to bring in a few more voices and get to a couple extra sets before we wrap. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, so we also found the 3.5% a little, I don't know, shocking, like kind of hard to grasp, hard to wrap your head around, like that number being so small and having such a large impact. And then we also talked about like having the different pillars and having like an advocate or an ally within each of those pillars and how important that is. And there were comments about like Black Lives Matter and how Black Lives Matter has had like a relatively, what people might describe as a relatively like successful movement, and how large their protests were and how like, you know, world stopping at certain periods of time, we can mark that, and how sometimes there are many protests when we talk about Palestine and Israel on the pro-Palestine side, but they're not like massive in comparison. And there was a comment on but that there's progress. So like from 2021, we're seeing a lot more pro-Palestinian people now versus then. And even in 2014, there was a comment on, you know, 2014, if you went to like a Students for Justice in Palestine or something like that, most of the people would be Arab. And I didn't mention this in the group, but just my own personal thoughts, because we ran out of time. I was in Students for Justice in Palestine in 2014 on an HBC campus, which is like a kind of a taboo topic. A lot of people, not that they don't care, they kind of just are unaware of it, despite many like Black American revolutionaries like aligning themselves with the Palestinian movement. But I was thinking about having like a broad base, like you said, because I think what a lot of oppressors do is make their side accessible to everybody. And I think in a lot of movements throughout the Muslim world, don't kill me on it. In a lot of movements throughout the Muslim world, it is targeted towards Arabs and Muslims, and it isn't made accessible for people who aren't that. And I've seen that even, and I think we've sort of gotten over this hump in like the pro-Palestinian movement, but when it first happened, I was on many calls where a lot of Arab Americans said, well, we stood up for you during the murder of George Floyd. You need, it's your time to do this now. And it's again that shame that comes in of trying to point the finger with very incorrect data and takes and all of that. That hurting the movement more than helping.
Thank you. There's so much importance in what you just shared. I didn't get your name. It's your name.
Oh, Sade.
Sade. Yeah, thank you, Sade. There's a ton to say here. I want to just keep it brief with 2 quick points. Like number one, you know, in my personal assessment, I think we have totally this is a watershed moment for Palestine in the broad base of support, like globally. and again, I totally can understand how like it might be hard to see it sometimes, but what I want to remind us of is like the size of a protest is not the indication of the size of a movement. Like it's really important. Again, if I am a single mom with 2 kids, if I am a grandma, like maybe I can't march, right? Like the march cannot be the only indication of the size of the movement. So and that's honestly again one of the few things that like gives me so much hope when I think about the genocide right now. Like it's very important. And to your point as well about like when movements fail, when movements or succeed, often has to do with how accessible do they make it to others. I really urge us to think about values-based activism instead of identity-based activism. Like I think that is like a freaking game changer. And the more we can do that, the better we will all be off, right? Because it's really actually not about identity, it's about values. It's about like what are the ways in which I want to live in the world? How do I want to what do I want to bring to the world? And alhamdulillah, again, we are a community of shared values as Muslims, and how do I invite people in, right, to that journey of living their values? Again, a lot of this I learned from Marshall Gans. I hope nobody, for example, I hope nobody came here today as a favor to me, because I don't want you to like, yeah, sure, I feel good to see a room full of people. I don't want you to be here as a favor to me. I want to invite you in an opportunity to act on your values, right? And like it's just a game changer. Like that's part of why I'd say that everything I learned in his class a decade ago, like completely changed how I work, how I lead. Yeah. So again, I hope you're getting excited. Feel free to buy a copy of the book and you'll get a free one. You can give it to a friend if you're finished the series, etc. But really, really important stuff. Thank you, Shade. Okay. Okay, friends, I prepared a couple fun exercises. Of course, we won't have time for all of them, but I think
our group had something.
oh yes,
Yeah.
Nana. Okay, go ahead. All right. Let's make it brief. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
I think everything else we talked about, most people brought up, but we did struggle a lot with the idea of making violence work for yourself. I think one thing that's come out of the genocide in Palestine, but then also thinking about like Black Lives Matter and the movement against police brutality is that I feel like with the idea, there's the assumption that the other side has a conscience, or like if they see like videos of like someone being treated brutally or killed or maimed, like that's gonna spur some action or at least get them to think about things. But I feel like for a lot of people, it's the opposite. Like they can just scroll or like I feel like a lot of people say, well, what happened in the video? Like what caused them to be violent against that person? Like there's some context we're missing. So yeah, I think we struggle with that idea. I also mentioned a few years ago on Twitter, I got like illiterate because I like said like, you know, I don't think it's a good idea like to keep sharing like these videos of police brutality. Like like what are we expecting? Like this has been happening for decades and it's not doing anything. And everyone's like, well, you know, we need to like continue sharing these videos. People need to see the reality and whatnot. And like it's not. It's like at some point it's like it's not working when people are gonna get like it's not working.
Yeah. So amazing. Nana, right?
Nina.
Okay. Thank you. Super, super important because again, the technology is a double-edged sword. There's ways that we can reach people in new ways, and like so many of us are like profoundly desensitized to images of violence now, thanks to our smartphones. Like it's a clear reality. So the way I would respond to your point again is like organizers, movement leaders, you know, movement members, like we're responsible for making the assessments of when our tactics are working and when they're not working, right? It goes back to like that famous whatever Einstein quote, right? Definition of stupidity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. Like how so if again there's a plan, there's a strategy, we're looking at this as one tactic in a broader strategy, and in a specific audience that we're trying to reach, like it's not working, then why would we keep doing it? Like why don't we try something new? Why don't we be the sharks that keep swimming and draw from the Gene Sharp, you know, 198 plus nonviolent tactics like that we can learn from history and other places to try to make a change. So I know I'm speaking at a very high level, and we should apply these to every case specifically, right? What's the specific goal of the specific tactic for which audience? But that's, I think, the important takeaway that I want to remind us of, because what we're talking about, we're never inviting violence, obviously, but when in cases when it has been inevitable, good movements have found ways to make it backfire, right? So that's kind of the spirit that I want to like, and these are two important and different ideas that I want us to hold. Okay, we again, there was a couple different exercises. We won't have time for all of them. Let me basically ask if you all would prefer an individual activity or a group activity before we finish. I like the groups. Okay. So we're gonna skip this one. We might come back to this in our actually, we might come back to this next week in the post-election conversation, sphere of influence and sphere of concern. Just a quick question. Has anyone heard of this model? It comes not from political science literature, from the Stephen Covey seven habits of highly effective people. I feel like Osama, this is up your alley. You for sure know this as a self-improvement guru. So okay, we'll come back to that inshallah next week. But the last kind of activity I want to offer quickly, you can stay in your same groups, inshallah, but one of the many tools, again, from this huge body of literature comes, I think it's Bill Moyers, who came up with a a kind of simplification, right, of roles for social activists. And these are like personas, let's say. And the really important concept here is that, you know, every movement needs many roles, right? That was point number 4, I think, that I shared earlier. But this is kind of an interesting framing to think about different roles and kind of where do we, what gifts can we bring to the table? What strengths can we bring to the table to a collective group of people who are trying to advance social change? So basically, I think I'll just give you, yeah, like 7-ish minutes to go ahead and take a look at this. I'll send this also in follow-up resources, but again, I want you to kind of take a look and then just discuss amongst yourselves out of these 4 personas, like which kind of resonates with you personally and why. Amazing. I'll keep it up on the slide, but yeah, just before we close, sorry, I have a resources slide too, which I don't see. Anyway, I'll pull that up and just make sure we can close with some follow-up resources and what happens with our next 2 sessions, inshallah. But go ahead and yeah, just stay with that. Am I blocking you? And then the graphic here, the inner box are like generally effective tactics for these 4 different types of rules compared to the ineffective approaches on the outside, or less effective. I know it's a lot of oh shoot, sorry. You're all being good students trying to read everything, but you don't actually have to read everything. Do people generally like get the 4 personas: citizen, rebel, reformer, change agent? It's just one framing to kind of play with a little bit and what initially speaks to you most. And sorry, also think about this in the context of your role as a Center DC community member too. Right, we have a couple minutes before I wrap us up, inshallah. Cool.
No, I mean, like, I don't know about it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no, more.